command of the British forces, 60 years old, reserved and energetic, was travelling with his staff, 1,500 soldiers and half a dozen war correspondents, each accredited by the War Office to cover the fighting in South Africa. All were anxious to get the 2-week voyage over quickly so they could play their part in the fighting and get whatever share of the credit might be available. The most famous journalist on board was the least experienced of them all, the showy yet oddly unself-confident Winston Churchill, at 24 the correspondent of the Morning Post. He was closer to many of Buller's staff in terms of class and age than were the other correspondents, and the officers found him easy to talk to. Privately, Churchill was less concerned than the other correspondents about the need for haste. On Wednesday the 25th of October, 11 days into the voyage, he wrote to his mother to tell her of a briefing he had received from one of Buller's staff officers. "The main campaign, as I learn on the best possible authority," he wrote, "will begin about the 25th of December, and we should be at Pretoria via 14 Streams and Bloemfontein by the end of February." A war artist for the Illustrated London News was travelling on board, and during the voyage he sketched Buller and his ADC in deep discussion on the promenade deck. Churchill, wearing a cap, is standing behind them, listening to another staff officer. Perhaps this was the moment when he heard about Buller's plans. The artist was a difficult, self-promoting character called Melton Prior. At 54, he was one of the most battle-hardened journalists on board. Short, bald, with a shrill laugh, Prior was known at the Savage Club in London as the Screeching Billiard Ball. He represented a phase of British journalism which was fast coming to an end. The press camera, together with better methods of reproducing photographs on the page, were heralds of a new era. War artists were beginning to seem faintly anachronistic. Yet for the time being they had an important function to perform, since it was still very difficult to take usable photographs in the height of action. The large-scale war, which was just starting across Africa, would demand new approaches to reporting. The man who invented the profession of war correspondent, William Howard Russell, had shown an impressive independence of judgment during his reporting of the Crimean War. Russell liked to spend his time with the ordinary soldiers rather than with the generals, and he often showed as much sympathy for the sufferings of the Russian soldiers as he did for those of the British. But the onward march of imperialism during the 19th century hardened the attitudes of newspaper correspondents. By the mid-1860s, new men were setting a different tone, more opinionated and increasingly more nationalistic. Russell's great rival, Archibald Forbes, for instance, the hero of dozens of dashes on horseback, introduced a more personal style in which the adventures of the reporter began to play a much greater part. Many people grumbled that Forbes was too often the hero of his own reporting, and he was sometimes accused by his colleagues of stealing their stories. He usually scooped them, the noun scoop was already in use in the 1870s, by his sheer energy and his clever use of the available technology. Forbes had none of Russell's instinctive sense of objectivity. Everything he wrote was intended to further the national cause. If the British forces behaved discreditably, this would not appear in his reporting. The success of Forbes's style changed things. The tone of war reporting in the last quarter of the 19th century became unquestioning, even fawning. Archibald Forbes did not head off to South Africa to cover the Boer War. He was critically ill back in London. His death closed the door on an entire era. Probably the only non-imperialist on board the Dunnottar Castle was the Manchester Guardian correspondent, J.B. Atkins. He had been hand-picked, both for his views and his journalistic skill, by his redoubtable editor, Charles Prestwich Scott, who had made the Manchester Guardian a strong, though balanced, opponent of the war in South Africa. For Atkins, as for Scott, the Boer War...